Greetings. JC here for Interface with another edition of Stereo 101. Stereo 101 is a continuing series where we take a look at the different components in the home hi-fi system. This week we're going to talk about cassettes and cassette decks. Now you would think in this world of MP3s, iPods, and burnable CDs that the humble cassette would be just about dead. Well, that's not true. Lots of folks still have very large collections of cassette tapes that they've recorded and picked up over the years. Plus, there are many more who still enjoy recording to this format, especially from LPs and other analog sources. So let's take a closer look at the cassette. When you think about the highly sophisticated and very high-fidelity tape decks of today, it's hard to believe that the cassette format had such humble beginnings. The cassette format was introduced by Philips in Europe in 1963. By early 1964, machines were appearing in the United States with the Norelco name on them. They were actually rebadged Philips machines. Up to that point, Norelco was more well known for electric razors than tapes or anything having to do with audio. The cassette format competed directly with portable 3-inch and 5-inch open reel recorders of the time. The advantages over the open reel format were the fact that you didn't have to thread the tape, and the tapes offered more recording time with better fidelity. The original cassette recorders boasted a 6 kilohertz high end on their frequency response. However, I've seen a lot of these machines restored, and they can actually do a lot better than that. The cassette format evolved a great deal through the mid-60s, and by 1968 the first attempt was made at a truly high-fidelity cassette deck. This is the Advent 201. It is the mother of all high-fidelity cassette decks. This has a lot of cutting-edge features for 1968. First of all, the machine can accept the newly introduced chromium dioxide tape type. Also, this machine features the noise reduction system developed in 1968 by engineer Ray Dolby. The Dolby noise reduction system, as it would become known, is a mainstay of the cassette format to this day. Here's what cassette decks looked like in the early to mid-70s. The features are not much different from the original Advent, except now they were appearing in wood cases and they had a little bit more of a slicker design. In 1978, the Sony Corporation revolutionized the world of audio by introducing what they called the very first personal stereo system. The Walkman had a high-fidelity FM stereo radio plus a very high-fidelity cassette player on board that featured compatibility with chromium dioxide tapes and Dolby noise reduction. Right around the time that Sony released the first Walkman in 1978, another trend was taking off in the world of cassette audio. The all-in-one portable stereo system, or what would become known as the boombox, was becoming popular all over the world. Boomboxes were sophisticated, high-fidelity machines, including high-end speakers, a high-quality tape deck, and a very high-quality stereo tuner all in one portable box. Early boomboxes had inputs for magnetic phono cartridges, inputs for auxiliary line level devices, and auxiliary outputs, and extra speakers could be plugged into the back of a boombox as well. As the boombox evolved through the 1980s, it became rather complicated, with CD players and turntables being built into some of them. Unfortunately, the golden age of the boombox is a very short one. By 1986 or 1987, most boomboxes on the market were rather cheap and didn't boast the quality of the earlier boomboxes. By the early 1980s, the cassette format had come a long, long way. This is one of the earliest dual cassette decks that was offered by Technics. The machine has Dolby B and the newly introduced in 1980 Dolby C noise reduction. It's also compatible with normal, chrome, and metal tape. One of the more interesting adaptations of the cassette format in the early 80s was its use as a storage medium for data for the original personal computers. This is a Commodore 64 dataset that was designed to be used with the original Commodore 64 machine. The datasets were cheaper than the big 5¼ floppy drives of the time, and they offered reliable storage of a lot of data. However, I can tell you from personal experience that loading a large program could take anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes from a cassette. By the early 1990s, the mid-level cassette deck found in most home stereo systems had become a streamlined, simplified machine, featuring fluorescent meters, dual cassette deck wells, and minimal controls. Let's take a few minutes and look at cassette audio by the numbers. What can you expect from the cassette format? Well, the frequency response is usually between 20 and 17,000 Hertz on a well-maintained high-fidelity deck. This is variable, though, depending on the condition and what type of tape you use and how well the tape deck itself is maintained. Signal-to-noise ratio can be anywhere between 50 to 60 dB without noise reduction. This also depends on what type of tape you use. If you use Dolby B or C noise reduction, you can expect noise floors between -70 and -80 dB. Stereo separation usually ranges between 40 and 50 dB, and the wow and flutter on really good machines can be quite low, with a number somewhere around 0.05. When talking about the cassette format, a lot of people get confused when you start talking about different tape types. Let's take a look at each one and break it down a little bit. There have been 4 types of cassettes that have been introduced over the years. Type 1 is the original 1963 format of cassette tape. It's a direct descendant of open reel tape and uses ferric oxide for its magnetic layer. This is essentially just rust. These days, these tapes are referred to as normal tapes, or Type 1. They require a 120 microsecond EQ playback curve, and they require what we now call normal bias. Every cassette recorder ever made can record and play back normal tapes properly. In 1968, the chromium dioxide tape was introduced. This is Type 2, and it's commonly known as high bias or chrome. It uses a 70 microsecond EQ curve and requires higher bias than normal to be recorded properly. Machines that are able to record and play back chrome tape are usually pretty high-quality machines. Type 3 was an experimental format introduced in the 70s. These tapes were what is called a ferrochrome formulation. It's a combination of ferric oxide and chromium dioxide in different layers on the tape. They require 70 microsecond EQ for playback, and they require higher bias than normal position tapes to be recorded properly. However, it's not as high as what you need with chrome tape. This format proved to be very unstable. The tapes themselves would actually start to degrade after just a few plays, and the Type 3 position was removed from many tape decks in the early 1980s. However, if you come across these tapes, they can be played back with a 70 microsecond EQ curve. Type 4, or metal tapes, were introduced around 1980. Metal tapes actually use ground-up particles of raw metal in their magnetic layer. The metal tapes offer the widest frequency response, lowest noise, and best headroom of any tape ever introduced in the cassette format, and the machines that can record these tapes are widely available. Metal tapes are also able to be played back with a 70 microsecond curve, so any machine that has a position for a 70 microsecond playback for chrome will also play metal and ferrochrome as well. Modern cassette decks do not have these switches on the front of the machine. The switching is done by small holes that are punched into the top of the cassette. This can present a problem if you run into an extremely old tape, either a chrome or ferrochrome tape, that does not have these extra holes punched into the top of it. You can either swap the tape into a different shell, or you can simply reduce the high frequency response when playing them back. However, if these tapes were recorded with Dolby noise reduction, they're going to try and play back at 120 microsecond EQ in an automatic deck. So therefore, swapping it into another shell is the only way to get that to track properly. Cassette lengths available are anywhere from 10 minutes all the way up to 120 minutes, and some experimental tapes actually went longer than that. For high fidelity, don't go anywhere past 90 minutes. Tapes that run for 110 or 120 minutes are extremely thin and stretch easily. What is the longevity of a cassette tape? Well, some of the original tapes released in 1963 are still very much playable. Nobody quite knows. So generally, it's accepted that a cassette tape, if stored properly and not allowed to be exposed to moisture or excessive heat, should last for at least 40 to 50 years. Although the popularity of the cassette format has waned somewhat in most parts of the world due to the introduction of MP3s and other digital recording sources, it's still wildly popular in Mexico, South America, and the Far East. Therefore, the availability of blank cassettes is assured for decades to come. Today's high-end cassette decks offer great audio quality and an array of features that aren't available on vintage decks from years ago. One of my favorite features that's almost standard on a high-end tape deck today is a variable speed control for playback. This allows you to adjust the speed for a tape that may have been recorded on a machine that was slightly off speed, and years ago that was quite common. Many high-end tape decks today are bundled with other products in the same box. TEAC offers two that have CD players or CD recorders bundled in with the tape deck. A word of warning, though, when looking at new tape decks. There are a lot of cheap decks on the market today. Usually they have USB connections and boast the ability to dump the audio directly into your computer. A good rule of thumb, whether you're looking at a good tape deck or a really cheap tape deck that's not going to give you the playback quality that the cassette format can provide, is whether it comes equipped with Dolby noise reduction on board. Even if it's just Dolby B noise reduction and it doesn't offer Dolby C or Dolby SR, it's still going to be a higher quality tape deck. To play back a Dolby-ized tape properly, you must have a well-aligned, high-quality tape deck. Stereo 101 will continue next week. We're going to take a look at putting it all together, and we'll also talk a bit about interfacing some of the new modern digital devices with your home stereo system. For Interface, I'm JC.